What's up, you guys? Doing a little bit of a new kind of video here today where I'm not going to be showing my face because I want to show a video and talk about it. And the video we're going to be talking about is The School of Life's Introduction to Karl Marx. Now, I remember watching this video when I was first getting into Marxism, and it does give you some good baseline ideas of what Marx was saying. But recently I went and looked back on it, and it's just a really, really bad intro. And I was intro to Marxism, and I was reminded of it because Big Joel, great YouTuber, was criticizing School of Life for just pumping out tons of content. That doesn't really make much sense. It's not that philosophically consistent. So after watching his videos, I went back and I watched this breakdown of Marx, and I have a lot to say about it. The good, but mostly the bad. And also Steven Crowder did a video reacting to School of Life's talk about Marx. So in the future, maybe we can react to that goofball. But yeah, let's jump into this video here. I'm going to play it part by part and then break it down part by part.
Most people agree that we need to improve our economic system somehow. Yet we're also often keen to dismiss the ideas of capitalism's most famous and ambitious critic, Karl Marx. This isn't very surprising. In practice, his political and economic ideas have been used to design disastrously planned economies and nasty dictatorships.
So obviously I disagree with the characterization that it was Marxism itself that was used to create dictatorships. The only thing I can think of where that was kind of a thing that happened was Pol Pot's Cambodia, where he claimed to be a Marxist while him and party officials were saying that they didn't actually understand Marx. They weren't actually trying to implement socialism. They were just trying to seize power and claiming to be Marxists in the process of doing so. When you look at countries like the Soviet Union, Cuba, Vietnam, they did things like implementing free healthcare, free education, reducing homelessness, and the authoritarian tendencies that they had were there, but they were no worse than what we see under capitalist countries. When you look at the Soviet Union's various belligerent foreign policy interventions, a lot of times they were countering the U.S. doing something even more horrific, like the Soviet Union funding of the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, whereas the U.S. is funding the Contras, this right-wing paramilitary dictatorship that they're funding by selling crack on the streets. So if you're going to say that it's Marxism and communism that created these dictatorships, you have to address the fact that there are many, many capitalist countries that have devolved into dictatorship. And when he's talking about the failures of planned economies, like I said, these economies did abolish illiteracy, abolish homelessness in some cases, massively reduce poverty just by investing what was formerly profit into the working class. But there were flaws in the Soviet system especially, and of course we have to keep in mind all these countries face embargo from the United States specifically. As they're trying to grow their economies, they're blocked off from the rest of the world, and as they're trying to build socialism, they're dealing with economic attacks, subversion attacks, all these different things, all these modes of imperialism. But the Soviet Union's economy did develop into a giant bureaucracy, and there was wasted potential, and it just wasn't functioning as smoothly as it could have been. And there's lots of critiques and lots of work done by this, specifically by Michael Parenti and Che Guevara, on tracing why exactly the Soviet Union fell, how they allowed too much private capital in, according to Che. And Che believes that they too closely replicated the capitalist mode of production, that their form of state capitalism never evolved beyond state capitalism into socialism, and what Che called the new man and the creation of a new psychology beyond the individualistic capitalist psychology. Alright, let's move on with the video.
Nevertheless, we shouldn't reject Marx too quickly. We ought to see him as a guide whose diagnosis of capitalism's ills helps us to navigate towards a more promising future. Capitalism is going to have to be reformed, and Marx's analyses are going to be part of any answer.
This part's pretty good. Even if you're not a communist, it's hard to deny that Marx's analyses of capitalism are incredible. The thoroughness in which he analyzed the system is really useful. And of course there's been interpretations of Marx like Edward Bernstein, where it wasn't revolutionary Marxism, where he thought it was going to be progressively workers gain control of the means of production. But what Marx did was try to understand the system in its totality and understand how it functions and how it grows, seeing the system as one in movement. And that is really useful for anybody trying to understand how to fix the problems of today.
Marx was born in 1818 in Trier in Germany. Soon he became involved with the Communist Party, a tiny group of intellectuals advocating for the overthrow of the class system and the abolition of private property.
I'm not sure if Marx's Communist Party was made up of only a small number of intellectuals or not, or if there were a lot of workers that were a part of it. But at the time, there were tons of workers' uprisings that were sparking across Europe. So Marx was watching these happen, and he sought out to give workers the philosophical tools they needed to have their uprising and then create a revolutionary, much better society for the masses, which is when he starts investigating economics, philosophy, and, well, he's always doing philosophy. That's what he went to college for. But he starts looking into economics, anthropology, developing historical materialism, and trying to give the workers the philosophical tools they need to have their uprising.
He worked as a journalist and had to flee Germany, eventually settling in London. Marx wrote an enormous number of books and articles, sometimes with his friend Friedrich Engels. Mostly, Marx wrote about capitalism, the type of economy that dominates the Western world. It was, in his day, still getting going, and Marx was one of its most intelligent and perceptive critics.
There's a good point to be made here that in Marx's time, capitalism was just beginning. And one of the things that Marx observed was that capitalism is a system based on constant growth. It doesn't stagnate, it grows. So the capitalism of our day is not exactly the capitalism that Marx was dealing with, and he understood that it was going to change and we were going to need to use his method of dialectical and historical materialism to continue analyzing the economy. We'll talk a little bit more about historical materialism later, but it's kind of a disservice that the School of Life guy has not mentioned historical materialism at this point in the video, as it's such a fundamental component of all of Marx's theories about capitalism.
These were some of the problems he identified with it. Modern work is alienated. One of Marx's greatest insights is that work can be one of the sources of our greatest joys. But in order to be fulfilled at work, Marx wrote that workers need to see themselves in the objects they have created. Think of the person who built this chair. It's straightforward, strong, honest, and elegant. It's an example of how, at its best, labour offers us a chance to externalise what's good inside us. But this is increasingly rare in the modern world. Part of the problem is that modern work is incredibly specialised. Specialised jobs make the modern economy highly efficient, but they also mean that it's seldom possible for any one worker to derive a sense of the genuine contribution they might be making to the real needs of humanity.
Alright, so right here he's talking about the division of labor, and I don't know why he doesn't just say division of labor. That's pretty clearly the term that Marx uses for this phenomenon. But yeah, Marx and Engels observed that once you have private property develop and you have people who own the land and they're now profiting off that land, and a whole nother class of folks are working on the land, the people who own the land are going to divide the people who work the land into these super specialized jobs. One of the things that you're taught in school, if you grew up in America, is that Henry Ford revolutionized production by inventing the assembly line. What the assembly line is just hyper specialization of your labor, making the division of labor as strict as it can be. Having one person do one tiny part of the job all day and then passing it to someone else so you can just focus on your one tiny part of the job. And while the American education system looks at this and says, oh, how great is this? Look at all the things that Ford was able to produce. Marx says, what is the effect that that has on the worker? And of course, the masses of society are people who work. You're telling me this person has to stand there all day, 8 to 12 hours a day, and just turn a wrench, in the same exact motion every time? Do you think he really feels like he's benefiting society by working for Ford? Do you think he really feels like those cars that are being produced are his, as the company CEO takes home millions and millions of dollars and throws him the scraps? And this is what Marx talks about as far as alienation. And this is, alienation, when you talk about it with workers, it's something almost everybody understands. If you work a minimum wage or a crappy job, you don't feel like you're really a part of the company. You feel like you're being exploited. You feel like the bosses don't care about you. And it's because that's the reality. And that's what happens once you have division of labor, which is something that Marx observes as developing once humans develop this concept of private property, which again is him using historical materialism, which again here is not mentioned in this video, sadly.
Marx argued that modern work leads to alienation, Entfremdung. In other words, a feeling of disconnection between what you do all day and who you feel you really are and what you think you'd ideally be able to contribute to existence. Modern work is insecure. Capitalism makes the human being utterly expendable, just one factor among others in the forces of production, and one that can ruthlessly be let go the minute that costs rise or savings can be made through technology. And yet, as Marx knew deep inside each of us, we don't want to be arbitrarily let go. We're terrified of being abandoned. Communism isn't just an economic theory. Understood emotionally, it expresses a deep-seated longing that we always have a place in the world's heart, that we will not be cast out.
Alright, so right here he's talking about the division of labor, and I don't know why he doesn't just say division of labor. That's pretty clearly the term that Marx uses for this phenomenon. But yeah, Marx and Engels observed that once you have private property develop and you have people who own the land and they're now profiting off that land, and a whole nother class of folks are working on the land, the people who own the land are going to divide the people who work the land into these super specialized jobs. One of the things that you're taught in school if you grew up in America is that Henry Ford revolutionized production by inventing the assembly line. What the assembly line is just hyper specialization of your labor, making the division of labor as strict as it can be. Having one person do one tiny part of the job all day and then passing it to someone else so you can just focus on your one tiny part of the job. And while the American education system looks at this and says, oh, how great is this? Look at all the things that Ford was able to produce. Marx says, what is the effect that that has on the worker? And of course, the masses of society are people who work. You're telling me this person has to stand there all day, 8 to 12 hours a day, and just turn a wrench, in the same exact motion every time? Do you think he really feels like he's benefiting society by working for Ford? Do you think he really feels like those cars that are being produced are his as the company CEO takes home millions and millions of dollars and throws him the scraps? And this is what Marx talks about as far as alienation. And this is, alienation, when you talk about it with workers, it's something almost everybody understands. If you work a minimum wage or a crappy job, you don't feel like you're really a part of the company. You feel like you're being exploited. You feel like the bosses don't care about you. And it's because that's the reality. And that's what happens once you have division of labor, which is something that Marx observes as developing once humans develop this concept of private property, which again is him using historical materialism, which again here is not mentioned in this video, sadly.
Workers get paid little, while capitalists get rich. This is perhaps the most obvious qualm that Marx had with capitalism. In particular, he believed that capitalists shrink the wages of the labourers as much as possible in order to skim off a wide profit margin. He called this primitive accumulation, ursprüngliche Akkumulation.
Okay, not to be super specific Marxist nerd here arguing the semantics of Marx's arguments, but that's not really what primitive accumulation is. So our system is based on people who work the land for scraps and people who own the land for riches. So this presupposes that some people had gained the land somehow, right? Some people had accumulated wealth, and now they're not the ones who have to work, they're the ones who own. And the act of the people with the weapons saying, we now own the land, this is ours, and seizing the commons from the people, previously land that was publicly owned, saying this is now mine, is primitive accumulation. And the enforcement of this private property by weaponry, the seizure of the private property by those who own the weapons, is the state. The state are the weapons and the armies that forcefully uphold the laws and rights of private property owners. And these private property owners originally going and getting their land is primitive accumulation. And here he's talking about how capitalists drive their labor costs down to try and make their profits as high as possible by paying their workers as little as they can. This is also in Marx, of course. It's just not specifically what primitive accumulation is.
Whereas capitalists see profit as a reward for ingenuity and technological talent, Marx was far more damning. Profit is simply theft, and what you're stealing is the talent and hard work of your workforce. However much one dresses up the fundamentals, Marx insists that at its crudest, capitalism means paying a worker one price for doing something and then selling it to somebody else at a much higher price. Profit is the fancy term for exploitation.
I mean, this is just facts. A capitalist cannot pay you the full value of what your labor's created because then they wouldn't make a profit. It goes against the entire way that the system works. They need to turn a profit in order to continue their existence. But they still need to pay you what you need to survive, your means of subsistence. You need enough to afford food, water, shelter, and the necessities of life. But they're never going to pay you the full value of what your labor is worth because then they wouldn't make a profit. And of course, we know that in our system, the workers get scraps by the capitalists driving their wages down, whereas the capitalists accumulate mass amounts of wealth. And once you go back in history and look at the different ways in which humans use their labor prior to capitalism, it's obvious that profit is theft and that the capitalists are just stealing the talents and the hard work of their employees. And the example I always give is Elon Musk's company, right? He portrays himself as this sort of Tony Stark-style engineer who's coming up with all these genius ideas, but really he's just a capitalist. He just owns the land. The engineers who work for Tesla are the real ones coming up with innovation. And then if you look at NASA, which is a publicly funded scientific exploration type deal, similar to SpaceX, rather than funding space tourism or Minecraft cars like Elon Musk at SpaceX are because the production is determined by what turns a profit, NASA does things for exploration or for scientific discovery or for the public good. And that's because when you utilize labor for public good rather than stealing the gifts of labor for a profit, you can organize production to do a lot cooler stuff.
Capitalism is very unstable. Marx proposed that capitalist systems are characterized by a series of crises. Every crisis is dressed up by capitalists as being somehow freakish and rare and soon to be the last one. Far from it, argued Marx. Crises are endemic to capitalism, and they're caused by something rather odd. The fact that we're able to produce too much, far more than anyone needs to consume. Capitalist crises are crises of abundance, rather than, as in the past, crises of shortage.
Yes, this is true, and this is my go-to argument for when I'm telling people why Marx was right? Everybody's been brainwashed into thinking Marxism is this idea that can never work. Marx was an idiot. He thought the government should control everything. But in reality, Marx saw a lot of the flaws of capitalism inherent to capitalism as capitalism was still developing. Like we said, it was still in its early, younger stages than it is today. And then fast forward today, and you see in 2001 you had the dot-com crash, in 2008 you had the housing crash, and then now you're having the coronavirus crash. Just in my life, I've lived through 3 crashes, and like he says in the video, capitalists play it off like, oh, this is such and such happened and the market crashed, and then this little thing happened and the market crashed. But it's like, if you look at Marx, years ago he said, no, this system is based on crises of abundance, where you don't have enough people to purchase the goods that are being produced, and it's going to be very unstable and the system's going to crash. And we've invented ways to keep the system going when it crashes, mostly just dumping money and welfare into corporate America, into these businesses who are about to crash. And Marx predicted that was going to happen as well. He predicted the state would come in and bail out these private entities. So yeah, great argument for why Marx's theories are relevant today.
Our factories and systems are so efficient, we could give everyone on this planet a car, a house, access to a decent school and a hospital. And that's what so enraged Marx, but also made him so hopeful too. Few of us actually need to work because the modern economy is so productive. But rather than seeing this need not to work as the freedom it is, we complain about it masochistically and describe it by a pejorative word, unemployment. We should call it freedom.
Yes, humans are working so many hours and it's completely unnecessary. There was a contemporary study that was done showing that humans in modern day spend about 12.5 hours of their 40-hour plus work weeks actually working. So less than a fourth of the time they actually spend working while they're on the job. And this is because of the system where you have to sell your labor to someone in order to survive, in order to afford food, shelter, and water, the things that you need. It forces us to stay at work longer than we need to. Our labor power should have freed us from having to be stuck in these sort of cages all day doing the same monotonous tasks over and over again, but it hasn't because we haven't abolished the system and the world is still run by a handful of capitalists. And under capitalism, people work more than they did in any other system other than slavery. Even in feudalism, which of course nobody's arguing for, the serfs would work 3 to 4 hours a day because you don't need to work 8 to 12 hours a day to survive. It doesn't make any sense. So Marx didn't think we shouldn't have jobs or shouldn't utilize human labor power, but he thought that human labor power should be used to free the masses rather than to enrich a few people. Kind of sounds like common sense to me as a worker. I don't know about y'all.
There's so much unemployment for a good and deeply admirable reason, because we're so good at making things efficiently. We're not all needed at the coalface. But in that case, we should, thought Marx, make leisure admirable. We should redistribute the wealth of the massive corporations that make so much surplus money and give it to everyone. This is, in its own way, as beautiful a dream as Jesus' promise of heaven, but a good deal more realistic sounding.
Oh no, Karl Marx is rolling in his grave. You did not just compare communism to heaven. One thing you'll learn if you actually take the time to read Marx and Engels, which I'm not sure this friend did before making this video, is that they do not pitch for a utopian system. They're very anti-utopian. The idea of dialectical and historical materialism is based on looking at the conditions as they exist, right? Not as you want them to exist, but looking at things and their contradictions in their totality and then what can emerge in the future. And the main contradiction within capitalism is those who work versus those who own. So the way to the future is for the workers to seize power. They never described what communism exactly was going to look like, really, other than when Marx says you can hunt and fish and do all these things in one day. They weren't pitching this utopian society. They were looking at the irrationality and contradictions that exist within capitalism and what would be the most rational, most likely way forward out of this system and to abolish this system's contradictions, which leave the masses in misery. It's not a utopian system. It's the idea that human labor power should be used for the good of the masses, and then that will hopefully free people from their alienation somewhat. So it's better. It's definitely better, but he never said it was going to be heaven, and Marx was super anti-dogmatic and obviously irreligious. And his goal was never to create heaven on earth. You never see him say anything even close to that anywhere in his writings, at least not that I'm aware of. And Marx said he wanted the wealth of corporations distributed to the people. No, he wanted workers to own the corporations. He didn't want corporations to exist. He wanted labor to be for communal benefit. Corporations are labor for the benefit of whoever owns stock in the corporation. I mean, maybe originally, yeah, he wanted some of the wealth to be redistributed after, like, revolution or something, but his idea was that we should just have corporations and redistribute their wealth to people. This is kind of the idea of social democracy. And also they talk about unemployment here, but don't mention that to Marx, unemployment was a reserve army of workers, so that when a capitalist fires their worker, when a worker dies or leaves, they can just hire someone new. There's always an army of people who want to sell their labor in order to survive better. He called it the reserve army of the unemployed, if I'm not mistaken. Oh, okay, let's move on. This is where this video is really kind of going off the rails. He says a lot of silly things.
Capitalism is bad for capitalists. Marx didn't think that capitalists were evil. For example, he was acutely aware of the sorrows and secret agonies that lay behind bourgeois marriage. Marx argued that marriage was actually an extension of business, and that the bourgeois family was fraught with tension, oppression, and resentment, with people staying together not for love, but for financial reasons.
This part's kind of true, but it's also speaking directly to indoctrinated Westerners with the way he's like, Marx didn't hate the capitalists. Marx cared about the capitalists too. Like, no, he kind of did hate the capitalists. He saw them as a product of the system, as personifications of capital, but he still saw them as people who were exploiting the masses for their own benefit. And he was especially ruthless towards academics, what he called bourgeois academics, who would defend the system and defend the capitalists rather than being intellectually rigorous and looking at the contradictions of capitalism. But the things about marriage are true, but Marx doesn't focus on like the capitalist marriage and go, oh, these poor capitalists. He talks about the monogamous family as an economic unit. And the monogamous family only arrives in society at the advent of private property. So once you have private property ownership, prior to that there was maternal law. So since there was group marriage, people would kind of marry and bang whoever they wanted, and then the kids were tracked by who their mother was, because the mother was the one who actually carried the child. But then once you have private property, men start wanting to pass their inheritance and their wealth down to their son. And you have the invention of paternal law, which eventually becomes the nuclear family, as we call it today, which is a family unit that capitalism's reliant on, where the man goes off and works, and sometimes the woman too. And then the woman is expected to give all this free labor to keep the home clean so the man can be off at work making a ton of money for a capitalist. And capitalism is reliant on the nuclear family, as we call it today. Marx wasn't that concerned with capitalist marriage. He talked about it, but it was mostly how this marriage is a product, this form of family and marriage is a product of capitalism, and how the masses have to kind of form this nuclear family if they're going to survive within capitalism. And this is what the book Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism is about, basically talking about women who have to stay with abusive husbands for economic reasons, or other such things, or how divorce is caused by people who are alienated all day and then come home and they're angry. So yeah, that was more what Marx was saying, not, oh no, the poor capitalists are getting married out of economic necessity, not love. I mean, he observed that they were doing it too, but he was more concerned with the masses.
Marx believed that the capitalist system forces everyone to put economic interests at the heart of their lives, so that they can no longer know deep, honest relationships. He called this psychological tendency commodity fetishism, Warenfetischismus, because it makes us value things that have no objective value. He wanted people to be freed from financial constraint, so that they could, at last, start to make sensible, healthy choices in their relationships.
This part's all good. The only thing that he doesn't talk about is when this kind of comes about. And obviously this sort of thing where we fetishize commodities has gotten much worse with consumerism, as we are all surrounded by technology and people are constantly trying to manufacture new wants in our brains. You need this, you want this, you gotta have this. But this only starts happening at the advent of coined currency. So once you have a commodity in money, which you can use to purchase all other commodities, that commodity is raised above all else. And that becomes the main pursuit of human beings, because money is now the most powerful thing in the world. And I mean, this is one way where we've seen Marx was really right. You know, consumerism has gotten out of control. People are just trying to show off how much wealth they have. That's all that Gucci is, and all these things where you can buy a brand name for an insane amount of money just to have the brand name. It's fetishizing these commodities and bringing coin currency above all else, so that's all that humans really care about anymore. Other than, I would argue that the working masses still hold on to these communal values and stuff. But as far as bourgeois society, definitely obsessed with gaining wealth and showing off wealth, which is a product of capitalism and more specifically the advent of coined currency.
The 20th century feminist answer to the oppression of women has been to argue that women should simply be able to go out to work. But Marx's answer was more subtle. This feminist insistence merely perpetuates human slavery. The point isn't that women should imitate the sufferings of their male colleagues. It's that men and women should have the permanent option to enjoy leisure.
This is another good point, and this is the whole point of intersectional socialism or feminist socialism. The idea that women now have the right to vote and men are now supposed to view them as their equals, but it still doesn't happen because of the system of capitalism. And also women are now out in the workforce with men too, which just means they're being exploited equally to men. And as I was talking about with that book, Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism, which you should all read, it's definitely not just about sex. It's about real arguments for why women's lives would be improved without the market system and without privatization. And yeah, women are still exploited under capitalism. There's no. It's great that we're making advances in women's rights and in equality and stuff like that. But humans can never truly be free until we abolish capitalism, or the masses can never truly be free until we abolish capitalism and until we abolish private property.
Why don't we all think a bit more like Marx? An important aspect of Marx's work is that he proposes that there's an insidious, subtle way in which the economic system colours the sort of ideas that we end up having. The economy generates what Marx termed an ideology. A capitalist society is one where most people, rich and poor, believe all sorts of things that are really just value judgments that relate back to the economic system. For example, that a person who doesn't work is worthless, that leisure beyond a few weeks a year is sinful, that more belongings will make us happier, and that worthwhile things and people will invariably make money. In short, one of the biggest evils of capitalism is not that there are corrupt people at the top. This is true in any human hierarchy. but that capitalist ideas teach all of us to be anxious, competitive, conformist, and politically complacent.
So this is what most people refer to as base and superstructure, the base being the economic system, which helps create culture and what people talk about, what we think about, and then that helps reinforce capitalism in turn. And I don't know that Marx and Engels ever used the term base and superstructure, but that's basically what it is, and Alain de Botton here, who's the School of Life guy, by the way, says that Marx thought this was subtle, right? That's not true. He did not think this was subtle. And there would be a lot more thinkers that expanded on these ideas of how capitalism brainwashes us, like Mark Fisher and Antonio Gramsci. But yes, the bourgeoisie owns everything, meaning also the media, so that they can push their ideas into the mainstream. And if everyone reads Jane Mayer's book, Dark Money, you can see that the most prestigious, and I say that with quotation marks and heavy sarcasm, universities in the United States have all had tons and tons of Koch brothers money and Republican think tank money dumped into them. Meaning even when you have people like Cornel West at Harvard or whatever, you also have these far-right people training people in Milton Friedmanite Chicago school economics that have been proven to not work. This privatization doesn't work for the masses. But that's not their job. Their whole job is to spread this ideology that upholds the bourgeoisie and upholds the ruling class. And this is how they brainwash people. And this is how you grew up your whole life never questioning capitalism. Or maybe you did, but you were told, yeah, it's not the best system, but nothing else can work. Don't read Marx, don't talk about socialism, nothing else can work. And they indoctrinate you with the ideas of the current economic system and the current economic order in which, a small group of people who don't work own everything and control most of the messaging you're getting.
Marx didn't only outline what was wrong with capitalism. We also get glimpses of what Marx wanted the ideal utopian future to be like. In his Communist Manifesto, he describes a world without private property or inherited wealth, with a steeply graduated income tax, centralized control of the banking, communication and transport industries, and free public education.
No. That was not Marx's ideal society, his ideal utopia. And the Manifesto is not a book where he lays that out. The Manifesto lays out the basic theories, yes, but it was a book written for the workers' uprising that was happening in Paris at the time, where they were looking to establish, or they did establish for 2 months, the Paris Commune. And Marx was writing this basically just to pump up the workers, but then also to give them the tools they needed to start working towards socialism and communism. And the first thing he said was get rid of inheritance, get rid of insane wealth inequality by putting a big income tax on, have the state seize control of the most powerful sectors of the economy, the industry and the banks, and then work to get education going right away so you can kind of unbrainwash people from the capitalist indoctrination they've had their whole lives, and also teach people to read, which was a huge thing at the time and is still a thing in a lot of more impoverished countries or countries who have been colonized. So this is Marx just laying out like the first steps. This is what you do right after you seize state power and you're looking to create socialism. This is in no way Marx saying this is the utopian society where you have a high income tax and free school. This video makes me mad. Read Marx before you make a video talking about what Marx said, please.
Marx also expected that communist society would allow people to develop lots of different sides of their natures. In communist society, it's possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow, to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, just as I have a mind without ever becoming hunter, fisherman, herdsman, or critic.
Yeah, this is kind of a goofy quote from the early Marx. I think it's in the German Ideology, where he describes, this is like the closest he ever gets to describing what like socialism or communism will be like. Like you will have the freedom to engage in all these activities that allow you to flourish, which is put simply, giving people the economic freedom, meeting people's basic needs so that they don't have to worry about how they're going to pay their rent, how they're spending 40 hours a week at work. They'll have time to do things that allow them to flourish, and humans will have time to develop themselves rather than just being stuck at work, making sure we have enough food so that we don't starve.
After Marx moved to London, he was supported by his friend and intellectual partner Friedrich Engels, a wealthy man whose father owned a cotton plant in Manchester. Engels covered Marx's debts and made sure his works were published. Capitalism paid for communism.
That's such a dumb line. capitalism paid for communism line. That is the line you hear from the most ridiculous right-wingers who have no idea what Marx even is. It shows that this guy doesn't understand Marx's idea of historical materialism, of that one economic system has contradictions and which lead to class struggle, which leads to the next system. So of course capitalism paid for socialism. That is the system we're in. Do you want Marx to seek out some kind of feudal lord and ask him to work the land so that Marx could write his theories about capitalism? Did you want Marx to own or be a slave? Capitalism is the economic system that Marx lived under. So yeah, capitalism paid for socialism. It was living in capitalism. The whole idea of Marxism is that capitalism will turn into socialism, so it makes perfect sense. I just hate that line. It's so goofy. Alright, moving on.
The two men even wrote each other adoring poetry. Marx was not a well-regarded or popular intellectual in his day. Respectable, conventional people of Marx's day would have laughed at the idea that his ideas could remake the world. Yet, just a few decades later, they did. His writings became the keystone for some of the most important ideological movements of the 20th century.
This is true. Marx was actually disillusioned with academia too. He saw all the young Hegelians, as they were called at the time, discussing philosophy, and mostly they were writing about atheism, and Marx said, what is this? You have the masses of society living in poverty, while these academics are sitting in their ivory tower writing about things that are only relevant to other academics. And Marx was like, why is nobody writing for the masses, giving them something to liberate themselves, giving them the philosophical tools to change their material condition? And this is what he sought out to do, and it's still today. Marxism, there's more Marxism in colleges, but it's not that popular, and there's a lot of people with heinous, ridiculous right-wing ideologies in college, in academia, and people with Marxist views who defend existing socialism, people like Michael Parenti, are blackballed from academia because those views are not accepted. The farthest left you can go is somebody like Cornel West. As soon as you start talking about the people who the Soviet Union raised out of poverty, you get blackballed. And this is what we call the class character of academia. I mean, even think about it. I went to college, but I left with $100,000 in debt because me and my family are working class. So you either have to take on extreme debt or just not go to these institutions to educate yourself, which gives academia the class character of wealthy people. And this was the same for Marx's time, and he called them bourgeois academics, and he showed no love to them. And I show no love to the bourgeois academics today who poo-poo any attempt to make socialism or who have no love for the masses and the workers like myself.
But Marx was like a brilliant doctor in the early days of medicine. He could recognize the nature of the disease, although he had no idea how to go about curing it.
No, wrong school of life. The only reason you think he had no idea about how to cure it is because you think Marx had these weird idealistic ideas for what communism should look like. Or not even idealistic, just the government does stuff. This is what Marx thought. The government could do stuff and then humans would be free from capitalism. Which is not true at all. Marx actually did know how to solve the problem. He saw workers as the agent of revolution, as we've been talking about. He saw a system in which a small minority of people who don't work oppress the masses who work, and he said, revolution will come from the masses who work, those who are exploited once they organize and demand a better society. Marx never specifically laid out what this society would look like because he saw that as being up to the workers, up to the proles. He would guide them and give them ideas and study economics thoroughly so that they would know how to fully dismantle the capitalist mode of production. But he never said this is what socialism will look like, this is what communism will look like. He just said that revolution will come from the workers, from the masses. Because that's obvious if you analyze the current system. So he did know how to solve it. He just didn't know how to predict the future, and he didn't try because he's not a dum-dum, and he knew nobody can predict the future. You can only interpret the past and your current conditions and look to use that to make a strategy for how to build a future world that's better than the one we currently live in.
At this point in history, we should all be Marxists, in the sense of agreeing with his diagnosis of our troubles. But we need to go out and find the cures that really will work. As Marx himself declared, and we deeply agree, philosophers until now have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it.
I mean, if you want everybody to be a Marxist, Alain de Botton School of Life, you should probably read Marx, because you're talking about how his diagnoses of the symptoms of the problem were correct, of his diagnoses of the contradictions of capitalism were correct, but then you're refusing to talk about, or maybe you don't know about, because you haven't actually read Marx, class struggle. Marx's main point was that revolution must come from the exploited masses. Marx's critiques and his analysis of capitalism are what give us the solution for transcending capitalism. And this video does not even mention, not only does it not mention historical materialism or dialectical materialism or philosophical materialism, it doesn't mention class struggle. How are you going to make a video saying this is what Marx thought without mentioning class struggle? But these videos, and Alain de Botton's whole channel here, School of Life, is a very capitalistic philosophy channel. He takes as many famous philosophers as he can, most who it looks like he's only read the Wikipedia pages of, and he makes incomplete, sometimes wrong, videos about what these philosophers thought in order so people can watch these short YouTube channels rather than reading these complex books and be like, oh, now I know what Sartre thought. Oh, now I know what Marx thought. But, like, some of this stuff is so wrong. Like, yes, this can give you kind of an idea of what Marx thought, but this basically portrays Marx as a utopian who thought everyone should be unemployed and lazy all day, which is totally not what Marx wrote. You know, he wrote about class struggle and building a new society through the proletariat. So yeah, this was really fun to look back at and break down. Like I said, Steven Crowder also did a breakdown of this video, so I might then go look at Steven Crowder's breakdown and respond to that as well. So thank you guys for watching this. Let me know if you like this weird kind of video where you can't see my face, or if you want me to figure out a way to get my face on a camera. I don't have a camera right now, but maybe I'll look into that. So yeah, peace out guys, thanks for watching.